I've learned from my mistakes, and I'm sure I could repeat them exactly.
It was said in the 1980s that comedy was the new rock and roll. It never quite got there, realistically. It never even got close. In the very early 60s, Vaughan Meader and Bob Newhart both had multi-month chart-topping albums in the US, and here in Australia, impressionist Billy Birmingham had a record-breaking 7 consecutive number-one albums between 1987 and 2006. But while I don't think the argument can be truly sustained then, indulge me in an analogy for a moment here. In rock and roll, Elvis Presley was a young man who burst upon the music scene at the cusp of a new era, made a brilliant initial impression, produced a sustained body of work that became the gold standard for a genre he didn't invent but came to personify, and then settled into an extended career and personal malaise during which he would briefly revive his interests and flare brightly back to life, only to recede again almost immediately. As his salad days became more distant, his legend grew and became ossified when he met an early death, corrupted by the cruel vicissitudes of life. That story struck me as being remarkably similar to that of the comedian I believe to have been the funniest man ever to have walked the earth. A man Stephen Fry said had funniness the same way beautiful people have beauty. A man John Cleese called Amadeus and the best of us, whom David Dimbleby once said was the funniest Englishman since Chaplin, and who, when asked to respond to some of these platitudes, quipped, "Well, now is not the time for false modesty." Peter Cook, the child of comfortable middle-class parents deeply buried in the English upper middle class, arrived in the public eye in a blaze of glory as an undergraduate at Cambridge, writing a West End review by himself, wrote the groundbreaking show Beyond the Fringe, which started a long and now proud tradition of satire to the English stage. He starred on Broadway. His TV series with Dudley Moore was an integral artifact of swinging London in the mid-60s, and with Moore made the cult classic Observers film in Bedazzled. He amassed a reputation so formidable that in 2003 he was voted the greatest comedian ever by a large panel of peers, beating out John Cleese, Woody Allen, Eric Morecambe and Groucho Marx. All this by the time he was 28 years old. And then, in the second half of his life, Cook seemed to stop trying or seemed to become disinterested in furthering his legacy, his energies dulled by drink and grief at the loss of his first marriage. And from that arose a legend, after he died at the age of 57 in 1995, that he was a case of an artist who tragically squandered his potential, a glorious talent that lost its way. Let's examine the man and that legend. Peter Edward Cook was born in 1937 in the pleasant town of Torquay in Devon, England. His father was a career diplomat who served with distinction in Africa and the West Indies, who was hugely absent from Cook's childhood, so much so that the earliest Cook can remember him was when he returned from Nigeria after the war and was introduced to him as his father. Cook was confused, as he said later. We shook hands and agreed on it, but he was a total stranger to me. A lonely child, Cook's closest male role model was the family gardener. He followed him around obsessively with his own little spade, digging as he did. He gained from the gardener a lifelong obsession with bugs, worms, spiders, and other slithery, fangy, or crawly animals. A precocious child, Cook was aimed at a career in the civil service, perhaps even the Foreign Office like his father. A dream dashed when, as Cook put it, England simply ran out of colonies. Nevertheless, he attended Radley College, where, much to his own surprise, he found himself popular for his ability to make his fellow students laugh, initially with an impression of the house butler, whose dry sense of humour and stoic nature he elevated to the status of some kind of absurdist Ubermensch, a character he evolved into his most popular creation, E.L. Whisty, the park bench visionary and seer who saw the world completely inside out. Cook sold his first writing in 1955, earning 4 shillings for a comic vignette in Punch magazine. Deftly avoiding national service due to a suitably comedic allergy to feathers, he spent a gap year on the continent, polishing his French and German for a modern languages degree at Cambridge, where he first encountered comedy clubs, which he thought were dreadful and formed the first idea he had himself that he could do better. At Pembroke College, Cambridge, Cook began to develop a reputation as an extraordinary wit. First in Pembridge Smokers. Smokers were the male-only variety shows held in-house. The Footlights Smokers. Footlights was a sketch comedy society founded in 1883. Cook became president of Footlights in 1960 and was followed in subsequent years by luminaries and disciples such as Tim Brooke-Taylor, Graham Garden, Eric Idle, Clive James, Clive Anderson, Hugh Laurie, David Mitchell, and Tony Slattery. And in 1959 he made his first paid appearances as a full member of Footlights at their end-of-year review, The Last Laugh. This led to an offer for Cook to write for Kenneth Williams, which contributed to a successful West End review called Pieces of Eight. For a young man who was still an undergraduate to be contributing to a successful review, and its sequel, Over the Eight, which introduced the interesting fact sketch and the classic One Leg Too Few, was unheard of in British theatre. 1960 was a chaotic year. The stress of writing commissions put a strain on Cook's final exams, which he barely passed with the lowest second. In 1960, Robert Ponsonby, the head of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, hit upon the idea of forming a sort of supergroup from the best acts from the previous year's Footlights and its equivalent at Oxford University, the Review. His assistant, Johnny Bassett, recommended his piano-playing friend, the diminutive Dudley Moore, who in turn recommended the quick-witted Alan Bennett. Bassett also recalled the star of the 1957 Footlights, the brilliant and versatile Jonathan Miller, who insisted that Cook also be invited. Beyond the Fringe was a huge success, debuting in Edinburgh in August 1960 before arriving at the Fortune Theatre in London's West End in May 1961, where it created a sensation. Back then in England, any script for a publicly performed play had to be vetted by the Lord Chamberlain's office to make sure it complied to standards. No one ever said what the standards were. Beyond the Fringe being a satirical play, particularly one which directly lampooned the Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, raised the hackles of the LC. While the Macmillan sections were passed, a sketch parodying the Sermon on the Mount had changes requested, plus it was suggested that the famous 2T sketch, where Moore, Miller and Cook made fun of various royal personages, be toned down, and the stage announcement during the Manly advertising sketch of "Enter a trio of hideous old queens" had to be amended. Despite the whole purpose of the show being to satirise the archaic institutions of England, the cast complied and made the changes. Cook, however, got around these changes when he realised that he'd only been requested to bowdlerise the script, and there wasn't much they could do about his ad-libs, so he became increasingly prolific and pointed in his use of them, especially on the night that the target of one of the sketches, Macmillan himself, was there, and Cook launched into an impersonation of him, declaring, "When I've got a spare evening, there's nothing I like better than to wander over to a theatre and sit there listening to a group of sappy, urgent, vibrant young satirists with a stupid great grin spread all over my silly old face." An unprecedented move, something no British performer had ever done, but apparently Macmillan took it in good humour. Beyond the Fringe transferred to New York in 1962, where President Kennedy took in a show, and the show was an even greater success. While he was in New York, the BBC launched its first satirical programme, That Was the Week That Was, with David Frost at the helm. Cook loathed Frost, who had been Secretary of Footlights while he was a cast member, referring to him as the bubonic plagiarist, which didn't stop Cook from writing for TW3. In the summer of 1963, Cook saved Frost from drowning in a swimming pool in Connecticut, an act he repeatedly described as his greatest ever regret. TW3 was groundbreaking television at the time, as much as Beyond the Fringe, to which it was deeply indebted, was to theatre. Frost later went on to give John Cleese, Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett, a man Cleese described as the best timer of a joke he ever knew, their start on television in 1967's Frost Report. In 1961, in order to get around the censorious machinations of the Lord Chamberlain, Cook helped found the Establishment Club in Greek Street, Soho, a dream he'd held in practicality since his last year at Cambridge. He did this because performances at the private clubs were exempt from the Lord Chamberlain's interventions. The club hosted Lenny Bruce, amongst others, and gave a start to comics such as Barry Humphries, a lifelong friend of Cook's. Eleanor Bron, Cook advocated to have her made the first female cast member of Footlights, and in the basement, Dudley Moore and his trio provided music for patrons. He invested in Private Eye magazine, a satirical rival to his former paymaster's Punch, which remained a lifelong passion. While Private Eye weathered the storm, still popular to this day, the Establishment, which opened a sister club in New York in 1963, had to close its doors largely because Cook himself was away so much in America.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a special welcome to all those of you who've been forced to eat spinach, the world's most ghastly vegetable.
1964 saw Cook debut on television on a consumer affairs program, On the Braden Beat, delivering surreal monologues as E.L. Wisty on many subjects, but generally never the one he was introduced to speaking on. Dudley Moore approached him to fill in with some sketches on his Dudley Moore Show, which evolved thereupon into not only Dudley Moore but also Peter Cook, and finally Not Only But Also. Cook's work on Nova had evolved from sharp-eyed satire to a broad absurdism. Along with his new sketches, it took the best of Cook's writings from his previous reviews and broadcast them to a wider audience. From The Ravens, where Sir Arthur Streeb-Griebling muses on the futility of teaching ravens to fly underwater, to John Lennon reciting from A Spaniard in the Works, The Leaping Berillians, an order of nuns dedicated to chastity through constant bouncing on trampolines, Dudley playing piano while being submerged in the Thames, Streeb-Griebling's Frog and Peach, possibly the most horrible restaurant in the world, Bo Dudley, the rhythmic voodoo singer, musical guests like Dionne Warwick and Dusty Springfield on consecutive weeks, the send-up of George Harrison, who was a devotee of the Chinese banjo player Ravioli, and featured John Lennon in what may have been his first public appearance in his granny glasses, as the doorman of the Ad Lav Club, the most exclusive gentleman's toilet in London. In 1966, he and Moore made their film debut in the Michael Caine vehicle The Wrong Box. It seemed like, at the very peak of swinging London, Peter Cook was an unstoppable force. And then, almost overnight it would seem, he stopped. Cook's circumstances came to change across 1967. Having swept all before him to this point, it seemed that movies was the next logical step, the graduation to a normalised worldwide fame. But the making of Bedazzled was a torturous process for Cook. For a man used to short-form, largely improvised routines, the discipline and repetitiveness of filmmaking was torturous for him, and boredom was his anathema. That becomes important later. Also, his relationship with Moore was deteriorating. Moore was simply a more broadly marketable property, and he could parlay that up into greater exposure and recognition, eventually becoming a twice Academy Award-nominated star. Bedazzled seemed to play off Moore's greater popularity, and it also emphasised the fact that Moore was a much more natural and watchable actor than Cook, whose aloof and arrogant persona more or less worked playing the stylish Devil George, but he never became any more than a walk-on in films because of his stunting acting abilities. But the worst was the ending of his marriage to university sweetheart Wendy, mother of his two daughters. She'd been feeling increasingly isolated by Cook's fame, a guest at her own dinner party, as she put it, and Cook's affair with actress Judy Huxtable strained things further. Cook, bored by the inactivity of filmmaking and unable to make sense of the two most important relationships in his life, took solace in drink. His separation from Wendy and his inability to get the kind of critical purchase from his film projects exacerbated what was to this point his social drinking, and within a terrifyingly short period of time, Cook was a mostly functioning but still hopeless alcoholic. Looking back from the point of his death, when torrents of sententious balderdash came rolling down about how this brilliant young man was somehow a tragic figure because, unlike Dudley Moore, he never achieved whatever his true potential would have allowed him to somehow manifest. While Moore went on to a successful Academy Award-nominated acting career, Cook never seemed to have his heart in it. There were movies, not especially good ones. His reunion with Moore in Hound of the Baskervilles was terrible, and they soon degenerated into occasionally entertaining cameos like The Princess Bride or his scene-stealing turn in an episode of the popular sitcom One Foot in the Grave, to the inexplicable earth is he doing in the scene from Great Balls of Fire, or next to a hysterically overacting Faye Dunaway in Supergirl. In the 1980s, he started to get roles alongside the new generation of comedians who grew up with him, appearing in the first episode of Blackadder.
How was your battle?
Fine. Somebody cut my head off at one point, but otherwise everything went swimmingly.
Or a hysterical turn as a Tom Jones-loving assassin in comic strip.
Look, just because my second name is Jolly doesn't mean I have to be jolly all the fucking time.
He seemed to realise television suited him better as he enjoyed a revival towards the end of his life and made many memorable appearances in character where he had an interview capable of keeping pace with him like Chris Morris or Clive Anderson. While he was a sensational talk show guest, he was possibly the worst talk show host ever. His own talk show, Where Do I Sit, was cancelled after 3 shows as Cook was drunk and affected by prescription drugs for every episode, insulted his guests or wouldn't let them get a word in edgeways. There were various reunions with Moore, a disastrous tour of Australia in 1972, which fatally and finally fractured their relationship, with Cook going on a 2-week bender. A theatrical run in New York, which again saw Cook drunk and the consummate professional Moore reduced to screaming at him as he couldn't be roused to go on time. During the New York run, Cook and Moore would spend after hours recording what became the scatological Derek and Clive album, released after a few years circulating as a bootleg, which spawned 2 equally unedifying follow-ups. Basically long, drunken streams of consciousness by Cook with asides and interjections by Moore. The first album sold over 100,000 copies in the UK and made number 12. The follow-ups degenerated into long rants from Cook about how he resented Moore's burgeoning success. As Moore was just starting his film career, the albums were very embarrassing to him, but he allowed their release because he knew Cook simply needed the money. They were early hosts of Saturday Night Live when it was still known as NBC's Saturday Night, with Neil Sedaka as musical guest in 1976. But apart from a few talk show appearances and charity show reunions, they would never work again and would become progressively estranged over the following years. Cook's marriage to Huxtable inevitably broke down with his drinking, Across the 80s, Cook became increasingly reclusive and people were often shocked to see him, bloated from drink, his once piercingly handsome features now harsh and seemingly too old for his face. He could still be counted on for a good performance, though, when he was roused. His protege, John Cleese, prevailed on him to appear each year from 1976 in the Amnesty International benefit shows, later called The Secret Policeman's Ball. It was at the 1979 show where, after reading a newspaper review complaining the show was all recycled material, Cook went home after the second to last night, wrote a 9-minute sketch, Entirely a Matter for You, lampooning a recently scandalous court case and performing it the next night. And he rolled back the years to the height of Beyond the Fringe. I think it says more that the cream of English comedy was prepared to give up 9 minutes of their stage time for a routine they'd never heard before, out of deference to Peter Cook.
Pervert! A worm! A self-confessed player of the pink oboe.
The last few years of Cook's life were, however, sunnier. In late 1989, he married a remarkable woman in Lin Cheong, who managed not only to curb Cook's drinking, but actually had him teetotal for a time. Offers of work came in from the new generation of comedians and media personality who grew up adoring him, and he was able to pick and choose from the roles that interested him the most. He went to great lengths to rehabilitate his relationship with Moore, never going so far as to apologise for his behaviour, but speaking at length in the press about how much he adored Dud. He became a gentler, calmer person who revelled quietly in the light of being considered a national treasure. But it couldn't last. In late 1994, Cook's beloved mother died. Try as Lynn did, he plunged into an epic, even by his standards, cycle of drinking. Despite his friends rallying around him, he lapsed into a coma on January 5, 1995, and died 2 days later. Cook always said that he was comfortable with his limited ambition and described himself late in life as the world's greatest slacker. While the press immediately played the wasted life card, his colleagues, including Eric Idle and Dudley Moore, who hosted a star-studded 2-day tribute to him in Los Angeles, ferociously countered. Stephen Fry, in perhaps the greatest moment of his whole career, gave an impassioned defence of Cook, announcing that to have been English in the latter half of the 20th century means you lived in the country that had Peter Cook. While a nation mourned, Lynn lapsed into a protracted depression. When she died in 2016, her ashes were laid next to Cook's unmarked plot in Hampstead Cemetery. Peter Cook was an extraordinary genius. And he was a genius such that he almost taints the legacy of a generation of comics who came after him, in so much as none of them could be thought of as not in some way derived from it. He is to comedy what Billie Holiday was to jazz singers. Did his early decline deny the world anything? Perhaps, but what was clear from his final days, what lesser we would get, would still be wonderful, but it would have been entirely on his own terms.